Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, this week I want to talk about a great resource that was published actually back in November of 2024, right after Ignite. So you might have seen this, you might have missed it, as there were a lot of announcements during that time frame, but I'm highlighting it now because it is a great resource for security defenders. So before we get started, we are going to be talking about Windows security. If we can give our regular disclaimer, because we are Microsoft full-time employees, we usually give a disclaimer for our podcast. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, as mentioned, we are in our field security sales business at Microsoft, both Andy and I. We do this show outside of work on our own time. We also self-fund the show. So in terms of our recording platform, our domains, all the ancillary tools we use to produce and bring the show to you every week, we fund that all ourselves. So Microsoft is a very generous social media policy. We have a wide latitude in what we can say. We can be critical of the company in a limited capacity as well. And we certainly appreciate and take advantage of that on this show. Now, generally, when we're talking about Microsoft technologies, we're doing it through the academic lens. We are not IT analysts. We're not reviewers. We're not here to say good or bad. We're just here to report the facts, ways defenders can harden their environment and better protect their organizations. So that's what we're here to do. Whenever we talk about Microsoft technologies, it's presented through that academic lens. What are the facts? What can it do? Why would you consider using it? And how can it help? So certainly as full-time employees, we of course want to remain in the good graces of our employer, and that could potentially be a conflict of interest in how we discuss and talk about things on the show. Again, we have a very generous social media policy, and Andy and I don't feel burdened by that. We feel like we can say what we want. We can shoot from the hip. We can talk from the heart. And we have and always will do that on this show. However, we think our listeners should be aware of who signs our paychecks because of that potential conflict of interest. And with that, let's talk about this Windows 11 security book, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was published back in November is this Windows 11 security book. And this book is absolutely critical if you're a security professional charged with protecting any Windows device. This is something that you should read over and understand. It's a soup to nuts on every single Windows security feature, their availability, how and why to use them, and then also initiatives that Microsoft has taken to secure the operating system. There's stuff in here for businesses, but there's also stuff in here for consumers and personal devices. So really just a great overall, for lack of a better word, like Bible for Windows security. And there's 7 different sections. We're going to just do an overview because each one of these sections, each one of the features within each section could be a show on its own. So I'm just going to highlight some of the things that I went through as I was reading this. So the first section to highlight is, hardware security. So in this, they talk about everything that is hardware security for Microsoft Windows. And so you have the TPM. So it talks about the TPM. It's a really interesting section because, the TPM has been the backbone for hardware-based security functions like Windows Hello, System Guard, BitLocker. And then it has a whole section on the Pluton security processor. And so, this is important because there has been a lot of attacks on the TPM chip over the last few years that now are fairly novel, that you can just, as long as you have physical access to a Windows device and it has a physical TPM chip, you can sniff those keys or whatever it is, like a BitLocker attack, and, have those readily available. Whereas this Microsoft Pluton security processor, Adam and I have talked about this on our show before, but it was announced in 2020, but the design was actually part of integrated hardware and operating system security capabilities in the Xbox One console way back in 2013, where Microsoft was in partnership with AMD and also within Azure Sphere to produce this essentially Pluton chip that integrates that TPM into the silicon so that these keys and everything cannot be sniffed. And so, super interesting topic. You can always dive more into this. So it has a whole section on it, as well as every single section has links to blogs, to learn documents within there to dive deeper into that particular section. And then on a side note, since we're talking about chip security, I just thought, it was really interesting that in February, Microsoft actually announced the first quantum chip. And so there's a whole blog article. I'm going to link it for you in the show notes. But if you want to learn about Microsoft's effort into the quantum chip, where this design essentially will allow qubits, which is the quantum computing bit, in order to scale up to something like 1 million qubits or something like that. Now, it's not there yet, but essentially this design is going to help accelerate quantum computing. And it's just, I thought it was just really interesting that, we are actually designing, we have people in that area that are designing silicon. It's not even silicon, because it's actually a different material that's made up of the chip itself. So the blog article is going to talk about the material that we use, the processing, and the design, and how it all went into that. So super interesting. Side note, obviously it's not about Windows security, but just, when we're talking about chips, I wanted to mention that. And then there's another section on silicon assisted security. So this will dive into virtualization based security. It'll talk about the hypervisor protected code integrity, or HVCI, other things like system guard, firmware attack surface reduction, and even something that, again, like I'm reading through this and there's features in here that like I may have like seen, but it reminded me that we have something called configuration lock on these secure core PCs, where we can actually deploy policy through Intune and lock configurations that prevent users from making unwanted changes to security settings. So you can, of course, like have them not be admins, but maybe they do need to be admin. But now we can just deploy a Intune configuration to lock security settings and then revert them back if there is a detected drift. So just a lot of really cool features. Again, this is a list of things that you can go through, and then within each section it has links to that specific one. So let's say in this configuration lock, it tells you all about it, but then you can click on the documentation, which will then go over to the Learn document to tell you how to actually deploy this particular feature.
I've been banging the drum on recent shows that Windows, and especially Windows 11, has been somewhat underappreciated for the engineering effort that's gone into securing and hardening the operating system. I know there's a persistent thread throughout computing history that Windows is insecure and Microsoft doesn't care about security, and there's always this or that security issue in Windows. And Windows is obviously difficult to secure because of the incredible number of hardware permutations it runs on. It's one of the most complex code bases ever created by humankind, one of the most complex computer science projects ever brought to market and commercialized. And so the effort to harden it and secure it is a long running thread. It's not something that can happen through snapping your fingers, because honestly, if Microsoft snaps its fingers, enterprises get upset. And so there's this delicate balancing act of how do you drive the state of the art forward in Windows while also respecting enterprises' ability to make their own decisions around their environment, which is one of the hallmarks of Windows, is its configurability and customizability, in that everyone can kind of run a little bit of their own flavor of it. And how do you maintain that while at the same time driving the state of the art forward? It's a delicate balancing act, and I think we've done a good job at that recently. And some of those decisions have been controversial over the years. You look at when Windows 11 shipped, there was the minimum requirement of 8th gen Intel Silicon, TPM 2.0, to drive the state of the art forward. And those were really seen as, again, controversial decisions at the time. And then there was the date set for Windows 10 end of life, which is approaching in October 2025 of this calendar year. And there's been this constant, I'd say, game of chicken with some people thinking Microsoft's going to back down and not going to commit to this. But if you look at the Secure Future Initiative at Microsoft, or SFI, that is this massive engineering sprint with thousands of engineers dedicated to it and permission from the CEO on down to prioritize security above all else. Whether it's backward compatibility or security, do security. Whether it's ship a new feature or security, do security. Everyone has permission and is measured on their annual performance review, what we call a connect. You have a core priority that you must say how you contributed to the state of art in security at Microsoft. And so those changes all add up over time. Shavings add up to a pile. So making that change to Windows 11's requirements from day one, setting an end of life for Windows 10. Look at Copilot Plus PCs, which shipped last summer. So now almost a year in market. Those all brought additional security controls to market. Like they're all secured core PCs. They all ship with virtualization-based security on by default, BitLocker on by default, Windows Hello enhanced sign-in security on by default. They brought additional security requirements that you must meet in order to ship. And whether you're buying a Surface Laptop 7 from Microsoft, or you're buying a Lenovo PC or one from Dell or HP, if it's a Copilot Plus PC, it meets all those same requirements. And again, that started as a consumer product first, and then came to the enterprise over time a couple months later. And yet, the consumer state of the art was raised in security as well. So when you think of hardware security and Windows 11, a lot of work's been put into to up that bar. And yes, not everyone will buy a Copilot Plus PC day one. And yes, not everyone was running Windows 11 right away. In fact, adoption was a little bit of this slow and steady build over time. But now that we get to Windows 10 end of life, 4 years after Windows 11 shipped, and now we will get to the point when everyone's running Windows 11. Those decisions made 4 years ago now bear fruit, just like upping the requirements to gain that Copilot Plus PC certification will bear fruit over time as all PCs eventually become Copilot Plus PCs and they all meet those requirements. So they've done a good job of balancing the act of how do we allow enterprises to continue to have the customization and the configurability they demand while also raising the security bar over time. And the way we figured it out is it's through minimum requirements and defaults, and then allowing those to propagate over time. It's that slow burn down migration, which with an installed base of over 1 billion devices, 1 billion Windows devices in the world, is a long effort. And to get them moved to a higher plane of security is difficult, but I'm proud of what the team has accomplished. And then Andy, you touched on Pluton, also a Copilot Plus PC requirement. And again, how that came from the Xbox engineering group and then migrated to the rest of Windows over time. Xbox is a great example of effectively what's a really hardened Windows PC. It runs a customized version of Windows OS. It's running x86 or x64 silicon from AMD, and ultimately shares a lot of commonality with a PC. It is effectively a PC that's just bespoke for a specific purpose. And it uses a lot of hypervisor technologies to isolate where the game runs compared to the rest of the operating system and all those sorts of things as well. So Xbox has been this great test bed to up the security game for the rest of the Windows install base as well. And that's kind of a unique little benefit of Xbox being part of Microsoft. So some cool stuff here for sure.
All right. So in the operating system security section, there are multiple bullet points here. So in system security, encryption and data protection, network security, and virus and threat protection. But in the system security section, again, a lot of different things here, from device health attestation to certificates, code signing integrity. But one of the things, again, like as I was reading through this, I'm like, this was something that I didn't realize was a thing. Again, around configuration, there's a new thing that was announced last year that I missed it. Config refresh. So this is something that was introduced, and what it is now a new policy CSP that you can deploy through MDM. And when you're looking at configurations in, like, say, group policy, that refreshes every 90 minutes, and then MDM policy refreshes every 8 hours. But with this new config refresh, you can configure a policy to refresh your configuration as short as every 30 minutes or as long as every 24 hours. And so that's important if you have different policies, different configurations that you need to deploy or have it enable right away. And so something new, again, like as I'm reading through this, and something to note, because we're going to get through some of these other ones, this is a live document. This is being updated continuously with new features that are coming on the horizon, because some of these things that Adam and I talked about a couple of weeks ago are already in this Windows book of security. When data encryption, it talks about BitLocker and encrypted hard drives. It has that personal data encryption, which was announced a little while ago, which you can have essentially your own key to encrypt things within Windows if you want. Network security is also kind of interesting because what I wanted to highlight here, it talks about DNS security. And one of the things that we announced recently is Zero Trust DNS. That's not in here yet. I assume that it will show up eventually, but because it's probably still in preview right now and only on insider builds, it hasn't made it in here. But I want to highlight that real quick. The Zero Trust DNS, it integrates with the Windows DNS client, and now you're able to funnel your DNS queries to protective DNS servers that are controlled by Microsoft, and it can essentially force the Windows DNS client to use encrypted DNS in queries that are only sent to those protected DNS servers. When you're using Zero Trust DNS, it's supported over DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS, and only outbound traffic that's going to these permitted IP addresses that are resolved by these protected DNS servers is allowed. And you can block or have exceptions, by administrators. Everything is logged. And so you're going to protect against stuff like DNS hijacking, malicious communications like CNC servers, or data exfiltration to, known IPs or domains that are known to be attackers. So something that is on the horizon, it's in preview. You have to be on an insider build to test it, like in the Canary channel, but really something that is nice and included right now at no additional cost. I don't know if there will be any licensing associated with it in the future, but as of right now, it's in preview. So it's available for everyone to test out. Something that's pretty cool that's included. And then finally, in the virus and threat protection section under operating system security, there's sections on all the Defender, Defender Smart Screen, network protection, tamper protection for the AV agent within Defender for Endpoint, which is like, making sure that attackers cannot disable the AV protection. If you have that policy enabled, they will not be able to disable the security features like turning off real-time protection, turning off behavior monitoring, all of that, which is a common attack vector. A lot of EDR solutions do not have this built in. And so obviously the first thing that they're going to do, an attacker, when they get onto a device, is disable that EDR solution so that they can have free reign and escalate. And so Defender for Endpoint has that built in. So there's a lot of stuff in here, attack surface reduction rules. And again, it gives you a synopsis of what it is, then gives you a link to go and deep dive and, test it, turn it on, whatever you want to do with it. Application security, again, another major section in here, gives you stuff on application and driver control and application isolation. So there's a whole section in here on app control for business, which was formerly called Windows Defender Application Control. If you're familiar with WinDAC, we did a whole show on that a few years ago. Now it's called App Control for Business, and App Blocker, still alive and kicking, still included in Windows, and still a key portion of that app control. So a lot of people aren't familiar or may not even realize that we have application control built into Windows. So you don't have to go out and buy something different if you want to just use it within Windows. It's included in Windows Enterprise. Administrator protection, we did a whole show on that, and that's one of those new features, right? That's just included right into this section here. And they talk about application administrator protection, and then that vulnerable driver block list. There's a whole, things. If you are looking at drivers, it's one of the few areas that is really critical that has been unprotected for a long time, where malicious drivers can get installed. But now we have a block list that we are actively curating malicious drivers and putting them on. And by default, Windows has a block policy for that vulnerable driver list. So nothing you have to do unless you turn it off. It's already enabled by default.
Andy, I know you and I had the same experience when we first came to Microsoft, was learning about all of the security capabilities built into Windows. And this was Windows 10 at the time when you and I were both running around having these conversations. But being on the outside, I didn't realize it. And it doesn't always get publicized enough because Windows is such a big, hairy thing. All of these capabilities that are built in and are constantly being added to. And again, generally speaking, at no additional cost. Obviously, organizations have a Windows Enterprise subscription. And just like all subscription software, you expect it to evolve over time and to get more for your money. And certainly that's the case here. Is the team is working really hard, not just on shipping new features, but new security capabilities as well. And that's kind of been my ongoing point, is the state of the art of Windows security has evolved over time. David Weston and team have done a great job with this. And just pointing out like that vulnerable driver block list, this is where Windows has made a lot of its security enhancement over time, has been in offloading as many of drivers as possible to have Microsoft write them themselves. And so things like printers today, almost any printer you can go buy, you don't need to install a driver anymore. You can just stand it up, put it on your network, connect it to Wi-Fi, and Windows will recognize it and automatically do its thing, because there's been that standardization of print drivers over time and print protocols over time to basically get all the printer manufacturers out of making drivers, because they always are pretty terrible. And there's some new hardening capabilities around that as well, where you can turn on, I forget exactly what the toggle is, but if you go into your Windows printer settings, there's a toggle to turn on like additional printer security. And would certainly recommend everyone turn that on unless you find it breaks something. You could do a screen test and see how that works for you. And if it does, obviously leave that on, because that's another area. Drivers just in general are such a attack surface for malicious behavior. And if you can harden your drivers and limit your scope of drivers, that really helps as well. So great work there, team.
And if you're a fan of the show, you'll know that Adam and I love identity protection. We love talking about identity. And so there's a whole section in here on identity and passwordless sign in. And, we don't need to belabor, because if you've listened to the show, we have a ton of show information already on passwordless and how to enable it. But this section in the Windows security book gives you a great overview of all the different passwordless features that are in there. Windows Hello for Business, FIDO2 and pass keys that are all integrated, the web sign in, smart cards. One of the things I wanted to highlight again, as I was reading through this, I'm like, oh, this is something I guess new. Maybe I heard it in passing, but I'll highlight it here, is this advanced phishing protection in Microsoft Defender Smart Screen. And so this is something that is enabled, that if you want, it'll produce enhanced phishing protection to automatically detect when a user's Microsoft password is entered into any app or website. And then Windows will identify it if the app or site is securely authenticating to Microsoft, and warns if the credentials are risk. I mean, such a cool feature that is integrated into the Defender Smart Screen, and it's specifically for your work and school passwords. And so you can, let me see here. You do have to configure it using group policy or CSP from MDM or Intune, obviously. But when it's enabled, it gives you that advanced phishing protection. So a lot of cool stuff. Credential protection also as part of this identity protection. Credential guard, which has been around for a long time. Token protection. You also have things like access and management control for Windows resources. And so again, great section to learn about all the different identity protection things that are integrated into Windows.
Yeah, and I already touched on it, but I'll just briefly mention it here. I talked about with Copilot plus PCs and Windows Hello ESS, or enhanced sign-in security. That's a capability that reduces the risk of those credentials being sniffed or harvested while they transit inside your PC's internals. Copilot plus PCs all ship with that on by default. However, there are non-Copilot plus PCs that don't have that complete certification, but also have Windows Hello ESS on by default as well. And so that's just another one of those ways where Windows Hello is already a very secure, very safe solution, and we're continuing to harden it and build trust and security in it. So the way you can tell you have that is if you go into settings for Windows Hello, and there's a toggle for allow external Windows Hello devices. And if it's off by default, that means you have Windows Hello ESS. And you actually have to opt into it and reboot your PC to allow external devices to work. So for example, I have a Logitech Brio webcam. I'm actually talking into it right now that supports Windows Hello. However, I have to disable ESS to use it. So I choose not to use it. But if you don't see that toggle, then you don't have it. So there's no risk to turning it on. It's no less secure than what you have today. But just another example of how that state of the art is constantly being moved forward over time, where Windows Hello dates back many, many years to Windows 10's introduction in 2015. So it's been around for almost a decade. And, now it's continuously getting hardened and more secured over time. And in fact, if you remember all the hubbub about Windows Recall, which by the way has now shipped, it requires Windows Hello ESS to be used. But since all Copilot Plus PCs support ESS, it's not a problem. But that's an example of where we're stitching that security story together to enable the most secure experience with stuff like that.
There's a whole section, major section in here on privacy, which I found super interesting. So there's a privacy dashboard, which this is, I think, both for personal and for work. But for personal, you can sign into here and you can look at your browsing activity, all the apps and services that are using your Microsoft data, any access that you have that has been linked, based on like a sign in with Microsoft, apps that you've linked to your Microsoft account. All of that is in this privacy dashboard, which you can then go and revoke or delete or do whatever you need to do, how you want to manage it. So it's a great tool to have. There's also things that we've built into Microsoft, into Windows, like the privacy resource or transparency controls, where like right now I can see that in Windows, I'm using Windows and I have the microphone icon active in the lower right-hand corner. And it tells me if I hover over it, it's blue and it's like microphone is in use. It's being used by Microsoft Edge. And so these transparency controls for if your mic is in use, if your camera is in use, if your location is in use, it'll have that icon there. So something is using that right now and it'll tell you what is using it. So that's great, like transparency. And then also privacy resource usage you have within the settings of Windows, the app usage history. It provides you with a 7-day history of all the resource accessed for location, camera, microphone, phone calls, messaging, contacts, pictures, so on and so forth. And this will help you determine if your application is behaving as expected. So a lot of great privacy stuff that's actually built into Microsoft that I think is continuing to evolve.
Yeah, privacy is a differentiator for Microsoft because, like Apple, collecting personal data and selling it to advertisers is not our core business model. And so, like Apple also is a very strong privacy centric company. Microsoft is as well. Our CEO, Satya Nadella, has stated privacy is a fundamental human right. And we take this very seriously. It's a great opportunity to differentiate ourselves from some of the other big tech companies that do rely on collecting a tremendous amount of personal data and monetizing it. Google, Meta, Amazon, to name a few. And so that is a differentiator where Microsoft's more like Apple in that sense. That's not our core business model. And we do have a small advertising unit, although it's certainly not core to Microsoft's main businesses. But we certainly believe in privacy and empowering people to know what they're doing and what they're giving permission to. There's a great Steve Jobs quote he gave, and I'm going to mangle it. But the short version is, true privacy is understanding what permission you're giving in plain language, and being able to go to a simplified dashboard that shows that. Or like Andy said, having that microphone and that hover over so I can see my microphone is in use by Audacity and Microsoft Edge right now is very helpful to give me that clarity in very plain language, what's using my microphone, and giving me the controls to disable that if I want to. That's good privacy. And so very proud of that.
The 6th section here is on cloud services. And so this is, again, separated into 2 different areas for both your work information as well as your personal information. And in the work information, this is long and like just very extensive because it talks about different features like Entra ID, why you should join your device to Entra ID and how that protects it. It talks about Entra private access, internet access, enterprise state roaming, which again, I think this used to be called something different. Now it's called enterprise state roaming, but this is a feature that will allow you to keep your Windows settings across your different devices, which will help organizations reduce the time if a user gets a new device, they can import the settings using enterprise state roaming, and that is available with Entra ID Premium. Azure Attestation Service, we don't really talk about this a whole lot. Microsoft came out with this I think a couple of years ago. David Weston had a blog article about it. I think Adam and I briefly touched on it, but this is actually something that's pretty cool because organizations used to have to stand up their own attestation server, but now this is something that's done via Azure. And this device health attestation, it's part of that zero trust paradigm where you're trying to determine whether or not malicious code has been injected into that boot process. And so you're looking at data that's stored within the TPM. You're looking at the UEFI settings, secure boot, trusted boot, all the hardware and firmware security features that are there from when your PC powers up, and it can send a signal. And so what the Azure Attestation Service does is it verifies all that evidence that's provided by Windows Attestation component and validating a signature, ensuring that the platform configuration registers, or PCRs, match the values recomputed by replaying the measured boot log within the Azure service. It verifies that the TPM has a valid attestation identity key that's issued by an authenticated TPM, and then verifies all the security features are in the expected states. You can integrate this attestation service with Entra ID and conditional access and Intune, because once that verification is complete, the attestation returns a signed report with the security feature state to a relying party like Intune to assess that trustworthiness of the platform relative to the admin configured device compliance configurations, and then conditional access can then grant or deny based on that device compliance. This all happens behind the scenes without any admin intervention, because it's just part of that service. So now you can just say, I want to make sure that the device health is good to go, and as part of my compliance policy, and that Azure Attestation Service will just happen behind the scenes for you. So a really cool feature that we don't talk about, but it's literally a checkbox in the compliance policy, Windows Health Attestation, right? And then there's other things like Defender for Endpoint, of course, is going to have a whole section in here. Intune, Windows Update for Business, Autopilot, Auto Patch. We had a whole show on Auto Patch, which we brought in one of our program product managers from Microsoft to talk about that. So if you're interested in that, that's also generally available. Adam and I talked about Hot Patch, which is in this documentation as well, OneDrive for Business, Universal Print, so on and so forth. So a lot of great information on the cloud services that you might be touching when you're using a Windows device. And then also for personal, great section on here on talking about the MSA, or your Microsoft personal account, going passwordless with that, Find My Device features, OneDrive for Personal, and Personal Vault. Personal Vault's been around for a while. That's something that's within your OneDrive, personal OneDrive. And I use it actually to secure things like copies of my tax returns, anything with sensitive data on it, because it's an encrypted blob essentially that lives inside of your OneDrive that you have to then go ahead and unlock via like a FIDO2 security key like I have configured or something like that. So it's not just readily available. If for whatever reason the OneDrive service or my personal account is compromised, they can't just take this encrypted blob and unlock it. There has to be additional action. So I store other things, backup of copies that are sensitive within that vault. So a lot of great features for the cloud services.
Yeah, great stuff here. Not a ton to add at all, but just really good overview, because Windows does touch a lot of cloud services today. And I guess just one exciting note, we talked about Hot Patch a couple weeks ago. First Hot Patches went out just last Patch Tuesday. So as we record this 5 days ago, was the first ever Hot Patch rollout for client endpoints with Windows. So we mentioned that's generally available. And if that's not something you've checked out yet, we had our first organizations who got their security patches installed and no reboot required, just kept running. And if you want that to be you, check out Auto Patch and Hot Patch to learn more.
And the final section of the Windows security book is talking about security foundations and all the things that Microsoft has done over the years to make Windows more secure. So, Adam and I have mentioned the Secure Future Initiative. And so there's a whole section talking about that, links to our documentation for the SFI initiative, different things on the security development lifecycle and how Microsoft has gotten better at best practices during all phases of engineering and development. I found it interesting. There's a whole section in here on One Fuzz service, which I didn't really know was a thing, but that is a range of techniques and tools for threat modeling, static analysis, fuzz testing, code quality checks that are embedded into Windows for every engineer on the team from day one. And so these are just part of the SDL practices that Microsoft engineers have to do in order to keep up with the the security methods and up-to-date workflows for that code before it's released. And then there's stuff in here on offensive research, security engineering, Microsoft Insider Program, and bug bounty programs, certification for Windows, documentation for the FIPS 140 validation, the Federal Information Processing Standards, as well as common criteria, or CC. So you can pivot to the links to look at that certification. And then things on the secure supply chain. This is also something that has come up for me in the federal space, because there is a requirement based on a memo from, I think it was President Biden actually, on securing software bill of materials. And so in the Windows ecosystem, there is a way to check for this. Microsoft uses it. There's a tool that's in GitHub for both software bill of materials, or SBOM, as well as code signing tools that Microsoft uses to sign all the evidence and all the things that go into the software components for Windows. So again, a lot of information here on how Microsoft has worked towards becoming a better, essentially, software engineering, and how those components of the Secure Future Initiative have worked their way into producing a better, more secure Windows operating system. Insight that you have on that, Adam?
No, I think we've touched on it throughout the show with SFI and everything else. So it's certainly been, and we certainly feel the investment in security above all else across the company, and Windows has been no stranger to that.
Yeah, so definitely check this out. We're going to put the link in the show notes. It is an amazing resource for anyone who is looking to get better at Windows security, implement new features. This is a living document that is continually getting updated by our technical writers. So make sure you check it out. And if you have any questions or comments, let us know. So this link will be in our show notes, as well as our contact information if you have any questions or comments. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.